I'm Michael Correa, and this is Psych Exam Review. This video is part of a series looking at how you can study more effectively. And in this video, we're going to look at some of the biases, the illusions, and the myths that surround learning that might influence how you study. So it might be the case that students use ineffective techniques because they feel like those techniques are working. Or they might avoid using more effective techniques because those don't feel like they're working in the moment, even though in the long term, they're actually better for your learning. So we can start by looking at what students actually do. And one way to look at that is to look at survey data. And so we can look at a survey by Nate Kornell and Robert Bjork in 2007, where they asked 472 students at UCLA to answer some questions about how they regulate their own learning. And one of the things that they asked was whether students study the way that they study because a teacher or teachers taught them to study that way. So were you taught to study the way that you study or not? And in this case, 80% of the respondents said no. They weren't studying because somebody taught them to study that way. Now, this means either teachers aren't teaching students how to study, or they're teaching them techniques, but students aren't using them. And what this means is that students are probably trusting their own intuitions. They're going with how things feel to them. And this opens up the possibility that these biases, illusions, and myths are going to sneak in and influence what students are doing because it feels a certain way rather than it's actually based on research or the most effective techniques. Now, another thing that they asked students in this survey was whether they typically reread material as a way of studying. And this was a very popular approach that students had for studying. 76% of students said, yes, they typically reread the textbook, or they reread their notes, or they reread other course materials in order to prepare for an exam. And as we'll see later, this is not the most effective technique. It's quite inefficient. And yet, students have a great tendency to do this, partly because they're trusting how it feels. It might feel like you're studying when you're just rereading the textbook, but that doesn't mean that you're making the best use of your time. Okay, so we can now look at some of these biases that influence people, these cognitive biases, and then we can think about how they might relate to studying behavior. So one tendency people have is to be overconfident. And so there's a tendency when you come up with an answer to think that your answer is correct. And you may have had this happen to you many times in the past on an exam. You give an answer, you think that must be the right answer, and then later you get the test back and you find out, oh, that actually wasn't the right answer, even though I was totally sure that I had it right. So there's a tendency for people to be overconfident. One way you can assess this is by giving people tasks like spelling difficult words. So here's some words that are frequently misspelled. Try your best to spell all these words, and then tell me how confident you are in your answers. And then you look at the ones where people say, I'm sure, I'm 100% confident this is the correct spelling. And if you look at the accuracy of those 100% confident words, you find that they're only accurate about 80% of the time. And so what that suggests is, again, people feel that they know the answer, and so they don't check. They don't look and say, hey, maybe I'm misspelling this word. Maybe I should check that. Instead, they move on and think, okay, I've spelled it correctly. I'm sure of the answer. And as a result, they don't get that information they need, which is you've been spelling this word wrong for a long time, and you need to look a little more closely. Now, this is also related to the idea of illusory superiority. And so this is the tendency that people have to think that they're better than average in a variety of different areas. So if you ask people about how well they can drive, they have a tendency to say, well, I'm not the best driver on the road, but I'm better than most people. So, of course, most people can't be better than most people. It's not how it works. This is also known as the Lake Wobegon effect. And this is named after the fictional town Lake Wobegon. This is a place where all the children were above average, which, of course, is statistically impossible. All children can't be above average. But people have a tendency to view themselves as above average for a variety of different skills. And we can think about when it comes to studying or preparing for a test, you might think, well, I'm not going to get the highest grade in the class, but I bet I'll do better than most other students, or I've studied more than most students have, or, I'm going to be better at this than most students, when actually that's probably not the case. And students who are not better than average might be finding themselves thinking this way, even though it's not true. And even after they get the low test score, they might still think, well, there was one or two unfair questions, but I think I'm still doing better than average. And this is also related to what's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is named after David Dunning and Justin Kruger. And this is the idea that it's hard to know how good you are at things. It's hard to assess your own competence. And so when people don't have much competence, they have low skill in some task, or they don't have much background, they have a tendency to overestimate how good they are because they don't realize how much they don't know. So people with low competence tend to think, I'm really good at this, So maybe you start learning some subject, maybe you're an introductory psychology student, and you start learning a few things and you think, wow, I really know a lot about psychology now. But that's partly because you don't realize how much there is that you don't know yet. And the opposite of this is, of course, as your skill gets higher, you might have a tendency to start thinking that you don't know anything, to underestimate your ability. Because you start to realize, wow, even the things I thought I knew, I don't really fully understand them, or they're much more complicated than I initially thought they were, and it turns out I don't know anything. And so here's a little graph showing this. This is from the Wikipedia page on the Dunning-Kruger effect. And you can see this idea that as your competence increases, initially you have this big shoot in confidence, what they call the peak of Mount Stupid here, where you actually have low competence, but you think you're very competent. And then you drop down into this valley of despair. I couldn't help but notice that despair is actually misspelled on this chart. And maybe that relates to somebody's overconfidence while they were making this instead of checking how to spell despair. But then, as you gradually attain more and more competence, maybe you start to feel, okay, I'm actually getting better than most people for this. Okay, so that's the Dunning-Kruger effect and how it might influence how students choose to use their study time or how they feel in relation to some of their classmates. And a related idea to this is what's known as the curse of knowledge. And this is the idea that as you know more and more things, it becomes easy to forget that other people don't know those things. And so this is especially a problem when we think about teachers and professors, because they can be cursed by their own knowledge. Things can seem really obvious to them, and they think this doesn't need much explanation. Or the reason that they're using this particular example in lecture seems totally, stupidly obvious to them. They say, of course, this is an example of this theory. But they don't realize that students don't get that because students don't have the same background of knowledge. And one study that looked at this curse of knowledge idea was by Elizabeth Newton. This was for her PhD research from Stanford in 1990. And what Newton did was she gave people this very simple task where they worked with a partner and they were going to tap out a familiar song. So they got a list of familiar songs. They said, okay, choose one of these songs that everybody knows and tap the rhythm on the table. And your partner's job is to try to guess what song it is. And then they were asked, how well do you think your partner will do at this? How many of the songs do you think they'll be able to get correct? And the estimate that people gave was they thought, well, you know what? I bet 50% of these. These are all simple, recognizable songs. I bet my partner will be able to get about half of them correct. And so then they would tap this out. And so I'll give you an example of one of the songs. Now, of course, it's probably very difficult, if not impossible, for you to figure out what that song was. But for me, it seems totally obvious. I'm cursed by my knowledge. I knew what the song was going in. And so when I tap it out in my head, I'm hearing the lyrics. I feel the duration of each note, the melody. It all seems very obvious to me that I'm tapping out, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. And you probably heard that song, but you weren't able to recognize it just from the tapping. And so in this case, I'm cursed by my own knowledge. I think that you'll get it when in fact you won't. And so the estimate was that half of the songs would be able to be guessed, when the actual result was that the partners only got 2.5% of these songs correct. So this is a good demonstration that we can be cursed by our own knowledge. We think things are easy, and your teachers or professors might be cursed by their knowledge. Okay, and next we can look at the role of hindsight bias. And this was proposed by Baruch Fischhoff in 1975. And what hindsight bias refers to is the idea that once you know the answer, it's really hard to remember when you didn't know the answer. And this is also sometimes called the I knew it all along phenomenon. So often we see students have this where they take a test, they get an answer wrong, they see the answer key after the test, or they hear the explanation, and they say, oh, I knew that. But of course, they didn't know it. They got it wrong on the test. The test pretty objectively shows you didn't know it at the time of the test. But once you know the answer, it seems obvious. Now, one way you can look at this is you give people an anagram where you have a word, all the letters are mixed up, and you have to try to figure out what word it is that can use all the letters to make a word. And if you give people these anagrams, you ask them, to solve a bunch of them, you can see how difficult it is. There are some anagrams that are harder. But if you give people those same mixed up letters, and you also give them the answer, and you say, do you think you would have gotten this one? People tend to say, oh yeah, it seems obvious. Now, once you see the correct answer, it seems super easy. But when you have just the anagram without the answer, it's much harder to figure out because you don't know which letter is going to be first. It's much harder to think through. And so that's an example of this hindsight bias. And students tend to have this when they get tests back, right? It actually alters your perception of the past. You think, now that I know it now, I can't remember how I didn't know it before. It seems so obvious. And lastly, we have the bias of foresight bias. And this was proposed by Asher Coriat and Robert Bjork. And this is the idea that when you're studying, you have a tendency to think that you will remember certain things. So we can think of this bias as being, I will remember this. Right? In the future. You're thinking about in the future. Right now you're looking at the answer, you're looking at the theory, or you're looking through the steps of some particular process that you're studying, and you say, yeah, I'll remember this. Or you're looking at a flashcard with some foreign vocabulary word that you're learning. You look at it and say, okay, I'm going to remember this one. I know it. It's easy. In the future, on the test, I'll get this right. So I don't need to study it again, or I don't need to review it. And of course, this is a bias. There's a tendency that you won't remember it later. And this happens to me all the time. You know, I know all about these biases, but that doesn't stop them from occurring. And that's another important lesson. Just knowing about these isn't enough. So there's plenty of times where I think, oh, I'm going to remember the name of this album that a friend recommended to me. And then, of course, the next day, when I say, what was that album? I can't remember anything. I can't remember, the name of the band, the name of the album, any of that. And so by recognizing that this bias will influence you, you can start taking steps to prepare for it. Realize that you might need to have a backup system. Maybe you write it down, and then, of course, you can look back and actually get the answer. Because if you just trust your intuition of how it feels in the moment, it feels like it's memorable, it feels like I'm going to get it in the future, that's actually not a good way to plan, because you probably will forget it. Okay, so that's the idea of foresight bias. And now we can move to some illusions related to learning. And these are what are referred to as illusions of competence, where students feel that they're skilled in something, they feel they have competence, and yet they actually don't have the competence they think they have. And this can also be related back to that Dunning-Kruger effect. So you feel like you are good at something when actually you aren't. So one way this happens is that students have a tendency to mistake their familiarity with a topic with competence in that topic. So when you look through the textbook and you say, okay, yeah, I remember this, this is familiar to me, this is familiar. You think that means I'm competent in all these areas that I just sort of flipped through. But actually you're not. You couldn't come up with them on your own. You couldn't explain them to another person in great detail. And so one way we have this familiarity is students tend to do studying techniques like rereading that are really just about building familiarity. Or if you rewatch the lecture, you say, yeah, I remember everything from this lecture now that I've rewatched it. But if you sat down and I said, hey, tell me everything that was in the lecture yesterday without looking, you'd find that's much harder. You're not so competent. You can't fully explain. Okay, explain this theory that was presented in lecture yesterday. You say, well, I guess I'm actually, it looked familiar when I rewatched the video, but on my own, I'm not so competent. And a related idea to this is that your understanding is not the same as mastery. So this is the students that, will do poorly on a test, and then they come to the teacher after and they say, but I understood everything in class. And that might be true. They did understand everything in class. They were very fluent with the material. They understood the explanation as the professor stepped through, step by step. Here's this process that you're learning. But yeah, I get every step of the way. I know exactly how to solve this math problem, or I know exactly the steps of this process that we're learning. And yet, when you have to do it on your own, of course, that's much harder. You haven't actually mastered those steps just because you understand them. And so there's a tendency for students to mistake their understanding for actually being mastery. And another way you see this is, when they sort of go through step by step, they understand all the steps along the way, but that doesn't mean they can do them on their own. They actually couldn't put the steps together themselves. Or another way that you see this is in grouped problems. So this is especially an issue for math classes, where students will work through 10 of the same type of problem in a row. And by the 10th problem, it seems easy. Yeah, I know exactly what to do. You do this, you do this, you do this. Okay, you use this formula, and you get the answer. And then they think, I get this. I'm fluent in using the procedure. I understand how it works. And yet on the test, I got it wrong. And the reason they get it wrong in the test is now they don't know which strategy they're supposed to be using. They don't know which step-by-step program they're supposed to be using. So even if they understand all the steps, that fluency with it is different on the test, where it's mixed up with other problems. On the homework, okay, this is testing the way that was in the first half of the chapter. But then on the test, wait, is this part from the first chapter or the second chapter? Was it the second half of the chapter? We had 3 different approaches for these types of problems, and now I don't know which one to choose. And as a result, you get it wrong. Okay, so why do these illusions and these biases persist? Why do students keep on doing this when they should have evidence, especially when they do poorly on tests? Students who say, I knew that, and then they got it wrong, or they say, I understood in class, and then I failed the test. you think they just learn and say, hey, there's something wrong with my learning process here. I need to change what I'm doing. So why do these illusions persist? And this brings us to one of my favorite studies in cognitive psychology, looking at learning. And this is by Henry Roediger and Jeffrey Karpicke in 2006. And so what Roediger and Karpicke did was they had students study a passage. And this was a passage about the sun or about sea otters. And it had about 30 facts that they could learn from the passage, 30 concepts that they could learn. And so students were divided up into 3 groups in how they worked with this passage. So they had 7-minute sessions with the passage, and one group only studied the passage. In other words, they could just read the passage over and over. So they have a 7-minute session of studying, then they have a break, then they have another 7-minute session of studying, then they have another one, then they have another one. So they read this passage many times. The next group had 3 study sessions with the passage, and then they had one test at the end where they got a blank sheet of paper, and they were just told, write down what you remember from reading the passage. So they have 1 test and 3 study sessions. And then the third group had 1 study session. So you only get access to the passage for 7 minutes. And then all of the future 7-minute sessions are just a blank sheet of paper, write down what you remember. And they don't get any chance to go back and review the passage. And the students were then asked to make some judgments about their learning. Do you think this is going to work? Do you think reviewing the passage is better, or testing yourself on the passage? And what students predict is that reading the passage a bunch of times will be better. They'll remember it a lot more than testing themselves, because they don't get to look back and see how that went. So now we can take a look at the results. And so they either had a test after 5 minutes, or the test was a week later. And so here we can see this great chart summarizing why these illusions persist. Because if we look at the results of this study, what we can see is if the test is in 5 minutes, then study actually works pretty well. They remember just over 80% of the facts from the passage. And so this is why students get fooled, because when you just study, you review your notes, you reread the textbook, if you then take the test immediately, actually some of that will work for you. You'll get it right on the test. So in 5 minutes that works. And if you only got to read the passage 1 session and then the rest you were testing yourself, well, you don't remember quite as much because you didn't have as much time with the passage. But the interesting thing is where it flips. If the test is a week later, we see the opposite results. What we see is the students who read it over and over and over again, but then they don't get the test until a week later, they actually do much worse. They only remember about 40% of the passage. And the group that was testing themselves repeatedly, even though they only had 1 session with the passage, they actually do better. They recall more of that because they tested themselves on it repeatedly. And so another interesting part of this is that the amount of times the students read the passage. I mentioned before that most students typically reread when they're studying. And they also asked the students about how interesting they thought the passage was. And the group that read it over and over and over again, they said it was more boring. And they read it an average of 14.2 times. So they're reading this passage over and over, and yet a week later they barely remember it, and they thought it was boring. But the students who only got 1 time with the passage, they read it an average about, 3.4 times, then they actually remember more of it. They rated it as more interesting, and a week later they can actually remember more of it because they tested themselves on that material. And that's a strategy that we're going to be looking at in more detail in a future video. So I think this helps us to understand how these biases and these intuitions are influencing students' learning. They're doing the things that appear to work in the short term, if the test is in 5 minutes, and yet over the long term, those are actually the worst strategies that you can be using. Just rereading over and over again makes you bored, and it means you won't remember very much of it. Okay, so that's this study by Roediger and Karpicke. And so often students are told, don't be fooled. They're told, don't cram. Teachers always tell their students, don't cram for the test. It's not effective, don't cram. And of course, students still cram because it appears to work in the short term. We all know if you cram right before the test, some of that shows up on the test and you get it right. So what I like to tell my students is, don't be fooled by cramming. Don't let that temporary little spike, that increase in your performance where you can remember a few more things than you did without rereading, don't mistake that for real learning, because it's not real learning. In a week, it's going to be gone. And of course, students know this, but they're still fooled, right? They still have this happen over and over again. They cram just for the test, and then what happens, the real negative result is, in the long term, you have more work that you have to do. Now, when the midterm comes, you don't just have to study the new stuff from class and cram that. You also have to cram all that stuff you crammed a month ago because you've forgotten all of it. And so you want to make sure you're not being fooled by cramming. Right? It feels like it works if the test is immediate, but over the long term, it's not a good strategy. And I want to end by looking at some of the myths of learning. I think once you understand these biases and these illusions that people have about when they're learning or when they're not learning, you can understand why some of these myths persist. So I'm not going to go into great detail on these myths. I want this course to be practical, and I want to focus on how to improve your studying. And so I don't want to spend too much time sort of debunking some of these learning myths, but I'll just point these out as a way of saying we're not going to be talking about these in the future videos. We're not going to be using these strategies. So don't get your hopes up that I'm going to cover these or that these are actually going to be the effective ways to study. The first of these is the idea of learning styles. This is the idea that you're a visual learner or you're a kinesthetic learner or an auditory learner. And really the evidence for this is non-existent. It doesn't seem to be the case that you can only learn in particular ways. Now, people do have preferences. They might prefer reading over listening to an audiobook. But that doesn't mean that, if you prefer reading, that you can't learn from a podcast, or if you prefer listening, that you can't learn from a book. And so trying to divide these up and actually, specialize instruction in certain styles doesn't seem to make a difference in what students actually learn. And the techniques that we're going to be talking about in future videos are not going to be dependent on your learning style. And a related idea is the modality of how the information is presented. That if you just go to lecture, you remember a certain percentage. If you read, you remember a larger percentage. If you teach other people, you remember 90% or something like this. There's really no evidence for these numbers. And there might be some truth to the idea that the different levels of interaction with material will influence how well you remember it. But it's not the case that, if you read, you'll only remember 10%. Well, it depends how you read and, whether you're asking yourself questions while you're reading and what else you're doing. And so, anyway, don't put too much faith in those numbers, these sort of pyramids of which activities are supposedly always going to be superior to others. There's really not evidence that that's the case. Another idea is that you can multitask, you can do multiple things at once, and this is just not true. Our human attention is very narrow, very limited, and if you're trying to watch TV and study at the same time, or if you're listening to music and you're singing along to the music, then you're not really paying attention to what you're supposed to be studying. And so it's not possible to multitask. Your attention can flip from one to the other, but you can't concentrate on two things at the same time. And so we won't be talking about multitasking as a way to try to make your studying more efficient. Instead, we're going to say you should single task. You should focus on what it is you want to do and only focus on that. Next, we have the idea of subliminal learning or sleep learning, that you can listen to things while you're sleeping, or you can play things with hidden audio tracks on them, and this is somehow going to get into your unconscious or subconscious mind and influence your learning. There's really, again, no evidence for this. Doesn't seem to be anything. Conscious learning is what we're going to focus on. You're going to have a singular focus on what you're studying, and you're going to know you're studying it. It's going to be very conscious, and you're going to be reflecting on it. It's not going to be something that can happen through some magical unconscious processes. Similar, we have the idea of photographic memory. This is also a myth. There aren't people who can just, take a mental picture of things and then just remember them forever. Even top memory experts who specialize in memorizing lots of information, they all use strategies. They all use techniques. None of them say, well, I just have a photographic memory and I don't have to do any work and I just remember things. What we'll see throughout this course is studying and learning takes effort. There are no magic shortcuts. Yes, some people might be able to use certain strategies more efficiently than other people. Maybe the top memorizers are, using the same strategies as everybody else, but they're a little better at it. But there doesn't seem to be any case of somebody with a truly photographic memory. Related to this is the idea of speed reading. It is possible to improve your reading speed, but it's not really possible that you can be reading at 1,000 words per minute and still having the same level of comprehension and memory for that material later. So you can increase your reading speed to a certain degree, but there's not some magic solution where you're going to be flipping through the whole textbook in 30 minutes and remembering all of it. There's a lot of exaggerated claims about just how quickly people can read and how much you can remember from that speed reading. And lastly, we're not going to be going over any nootropic drugs. These are supposed cognitive enhancers. And while there might be drugs that could influence your attention or your ability to focus, caffeine might seem like an obvious choice. There are some things like that might have some minor effects. But there aren't any miracle drugs that are going to magically increase your IQ or improve your ability to study and just everything's going to stick if you just buy the right supplement. So again, you want to avoid these myths. You want to recognize that these are not the ways you should be pursuing. We're going to focus on more empirically based, research-driven ways of improving your studying. And these myths here are not those types of things. They're not supported by strong evidence. And so what I hope you can do throughout this course is we're going to try to shift from your strategies that are mostly based on intuitions to strategies that are based on research. And so I said I'd end every video with some assignments. And so the first assignment for this video is just to reflect on the biases and the illusions and the myths that I've talked about. You might recognize some and say, hey, this has happened to me before in this class. I felt really prepared for the exam and then I didn't do well. So why was that? Which bias was influencing you? Were you not studying something because you felt confident that you'd remember it later? Or were you just rereading the passage, and so you felt like you had learned a lot, but then when the test happened, 2 or 3 days later, you couldn't remember any of that stuff. So reflect on how these biases might have influenced your own past experiences. And then in terms of applying, what I want you to do is come up with just one thing, at least one thing. You might be able to come up with 3 or 4 that you can stop doing. So I said we want to replace the ineffective strategies. And so one of the first steps to this, before we learn the more effective strategies in the future, is just say, here's the things I'm doing that are probably wrong. I tend to reread the passage 10 times. Okay, I'm going to stop doing that, right? Because that will free up the time that you might need for the more effective strategies. And then over time, you can become more efficient by cutting the things that don't work and then replacing them gradually with things that do work. And I'll bring up one particular example that really is kind of heartbreaking to me. I surveyed my own students about some of the ways that they study. And one of the common answers that I didn't anticipate was a lot of students said that they would rewrite their notes before the test. They'd take their notes from class and then they would sit with an empty, blank notebook, and they would just copy them over again. And, this is just horribly inefficient. And I felt bad for these students because they care. They want to do well. They're working really hard, and yet they're choosing such an inefficient strategy. If they were to replace that with something more effective, they could get even better results in much less time. So if you have things like that you're doing, what I want you to do now is try to reflect on those and come up with a list of, here's the things I'm going to stop doing. And that way I'll have the time to replace these with more effective strategies in the future. Okay, and lastly, again, as always, I hope that you'll share some of your experiences, share some ideas that you have about learning in the comments. And so thanks for watching, and I look forward to hearing from some of you.